In terms of the structure, what I'd like to do this evening is just to tell you a little bit about the new centre that Glenn Lyons described at present, and then to reflect a bit on the topic that I've chosen for my seminar, my presentation this evening. Why adopt an historical approach to studying floods? And then to look at, in three different settings, how historical approaches bring value. So in flood science, flood education, and community resilience. And then to share some concluding thoughts. Let's look first at the Centre for Floods, Communities and Resilience. It's a collaborative venture between the Departments of Geography and Environmental Management and Construction and Property at UWE. And it builds on the strength of a team here who have got interdisciplinary interests in flood risk management. And the mission statement of the Centre is to promote resilient futures through a world-class programme of interdisciplinary research on floods and communities. So that interdisciplinarity is extremely important. And the Centre has four interlinking themes: water science and engineering, representation, perception and behaviour, stakeholder and community development and resilience, and policy and governance. And actually the most exciting elements for a research inquiry are in the interstices there, in the red area and beyond. And also, just to note, cross-cutting themes around scaling it up and down from the local, around flood education, around different knowledges, local, expert knowledge, and around science communication. And what is distinctive about the Centre is that it integrates a wide range of different activities. Research and knowledge exchange are important, but also science communication, community-based learning and community engagement, training and CPD, and teaching in the curriculum. And we see though that integration of different elements has been quite critical to its future. And we very much welcome partnership. So if you're in here listening to this talk and you think that there are areas of interest, then certainly please contact us. So what I want to do this evening is to reflect a bit on a historical approach to flooding research. When I did my PhD some eons ago now, doing historical work was really quite unusual in fluvial geomorphology. It's changed fortunately. What I want to do is initially just reflect on a historical approach and just to reflect on the character of floods as outliers. Floods are intermittent, they're clustered, you get flood-rich periods, you get acquiescent periods where there aren't many floods. And the recent periods in the UK, which might be described as flood-rich, bring big questions around the generating characteristics of floods, the implications for flood education, and the societal impacts of flood risk management, Historical floods, a historical approach, gives an opportunity to explore flood myths and to rebut them, potentially. And you'll see as I've structured the talk that I've identified one or two flood myths that you might like to counter or discuss. And it's clear if we look at the value of a historical approach, then if we look at the policy documentation, and if there's a growing amount around flood risk, we have documents like Learning to Live with Rivers, the ICE, the Institute of Civil Engineers, 2001. It's around learning to live with rivers. Learning lessons from the 2007 floods, the Pitt Review, the government's response to Pitt, and the Flood and Water Management Act. Again, the focus on particular floods and learning lessons from them. And it poses questions about the evidence base that we've got for those sorts of questions, answering those sorts of questions. There's also a changing language around flood management in the UK. If we look at the last 50 years, there's been changes from the language of land drainage, post-war, through to flood defence, through to flood risk management, and a gradual movement towards more integrated approaches and more multi-method approaches to land and water management. And that poses questions as to what is the resource base for that sort of approach, and indeed if community is aware of the changes, or communities are aware of the changes. Okay, in terms of setting the scene for this talk, I outline one or two elements of the flood research base that I bring to the table. I suppose I had a bit of a what's the right word? I suppose I had a change of tack from 2004 onwards. I was lucky enough to get a Royal Society Connecting People to Science project, and that was really my first foray into community-based learning and science communication. Before that, I'd really been a pure geomorphologist, if geomorphologists can be pure. And since that time, I've kept that interest in land forming processes, but I've also undertaken a series of projects which have developed my interest in flood risk in other contexts, not just the physical environment. And you can see there, I'm not going to go through them all, but when you're looking at flood risk management, very interdisciplinary area, and I've been fortunate enough to secure funding from a range of research councils, including ESRC, NERC, EPSRC, and AHRC. And if we look at the research base, I have just put some visuals together. My PhD was very much in historic river sensitivity to change, impacts of climate, flooding, and so on. And from there, I got an interest in historic flood patterns. And what I want to do in this talk this evening is to situate it within my Scottish experience. I put Muckle, Spates in the title, so I really had to go that route. And the Severn catchment, and also a little bit about the Bristol, because I thought there might be a few Bristol people here. And also around knowledges of extremes, about expert knowledge and local knowledge and how those interrelate. We've got an ESRC Flood Memories project running this now. I lead the AHRC Living Flood Histories Network. I've also got interest in actually spanning between my interests in flood risk management and my interests in pedagogy. So some of the work that I've done is deliberately focused to bring those synergies, and I hope some of those synergies will come to the centre. So the NERC Project Foster, for example, was about communicating expert flood science to local authorities. Okay, so what about historical sources and the nature of the archive? There's a whole series of questions around flood archives that I suppose as my research has progressed, I've started to mull over, about questions about what is archived, how is flood impact, flood character, flood impact and memory materialised, whose voice is actually captured, and how is archival evidence integrated into knowledge systems, whether they be lay, local, indigenous, vernacular or expert. And what is the value of this resource when we look at flood risk management in terms of natural and social science research? When I say the flood archive, this could mean what the resource in county record centres, it could be libraries, it could be personal archives. It's a term that is very embracing. Okay, so what I want to do now is just to look, I've taken 3 different areas where I've done work. The first is the River Severn catchment. What I want to do is to give you a bit of a flavour of the archive. Here you'll see a whole series of different types of sources, moving from gauge flow records right through different types, from epigraphic records of flood marks, right through different sorts of sources. And you'll see those that they operate over different timescales. They've got varying degrees of reliability. They've got varying degrees of corroboration. So in terms of the colour coding there, from the gauge record outwards. And so we have epigraphic records. This is an example in the Severn catchment at Worcester, and this is a superb series of flood marks from 1672 for present, and it notes the height of the November 1877 flood, 1770 flood rather, saying that the flood rose to the edge of this brass plate, being 10 inches higher than the flood of October 1672, and they're still adding to it. That flood, that 1770 flood, I've just pulled out 1 or 2 examples. This is from Bennett's History of Tewkesbury, just to rehearse. This year produced the greatest flood ever known in Tewkesbury. It was occasioned by an immense fall of snow, succeeded by heavy rain, which continued without intermission for 3 days and 3 nights. On November the 17th, the water came up St Mary's Lane and Gander Lane and united in Church Street. On the 18th, it rose so high, boats were necessary, and this is very important, in order to pass from the Hop Pole Inn to the Mason's Arms. In St Mary's, the lower stories of the houses were entirely underwater, and many of the inhabitants were taken out the chamber windows with their beds and furniture. The flood was also in the church, that's Tewkesbury Abbey, so that divine service could not be performed. 2 houses near the mills were washed down, but no lives were lost. And if we look, that's an example in Tewkesbury, but if we look at Elmore Parish Register, I'm not going to read through the whole part here, but again, it gives you an account of the same flood in a rural setting. On Monday, our seawalls broke in 3 places by reason of the great quantity of water that was continually running over them. And indeed, the scene this day was truly affecting. Some boats leading beasts half drowned out of their once dry grounds, others picking up their household goods which were afloat and going away. Almost all the cider, new and old, was damaged, and hoarded apples carried away, clean wheat in the bags wetted, and so it goes on. But it ends, there was a good crop of wheat the following year, about the back notwithstanding. Okay, there are historical records. Again, if I go through all these quotes, we'll be here all night, perhaps for 2 hours. But this is Duke of Buckingham's water, and I was reflecting a bit how people, communities name floods, and this is taken from Holinshed's Chronicle, 1587. And it says, before he could attain the Severn side, by force of continual rain and moisture, the river rose so high it overflowed all country adjoining. A sore flood, a high water, doing much harm, called Duke of Buckingham's great water. And so it goes on to describe extreme violence, the houses, extreme violence were overturned, children carried away in the fields, and so on. Archives can take other forms. They can be in forms of photographic evidence. These are photographs of summer floods in Tewkesbury, long before the flood of 2007. And there's also oral history accounts. When I did the first flood science communication project, one of the things that struck me, I was basing that very much as an archival project, and the number of people who came forward wanting to give oral history accounts of floods on the Severn, and Vera Smith we'll hear from later. In terms of the Scottish scene, I've done a lot of work in Scotland. You'll recognise, hopefully, that I'm not from these parts. The River Tay has a long history of flooding, and we see lots of winter floods there. But if we go to some areas of northeast Scotland, actually the largest flood on record is the August 1829 flood, which is known locally as the Muckle Spate, which is a summer frontal storm. And Thomas Dick Lauder, who was a local landowner, in fact it was his wife who owned the estate up in the Findhorn Valley in Scotland, he went round after the floods and wrote an account of those events. And he wrote a book of 230 pages, of which there are detailed accounts of flood hydrology and geomorphology and human impact. And I'm going to draw from that as part of this talk. And actually that book has been reprinted 4 times, most recently in 1997. So there's still a real interest in the Muckle Spate in northeast Scotland. And it's inspired other sorts of artwork. This is Landseer's picture of floods in the Highlands, and it's inspired by the floods of August 1829, sort of mythologizing of the natural in that picture. And also in local poetry, this is the Muckle Spate in a poem by David Grant, 160 verses. Again, I could have gone on with that, but the Thuf came rearing Doon frae Birse, and swept the Hawes o' Straw, and horse and pigs and kye were drowned and die, and sheep by scores in Arn. So he's remembering this event as a child. Okay, there's also the Froom, moving on. The Froom has a flood history itself, of course. Largest flood in living memory, July 1968. Whoops, let's go back. And we've got imagery, we've got photographs. This is down at Eastville, the flooding of the culverts, and through a project that we've been running in Eastville, we've also been gathering other historic photographs. And one of the things when we look at the archives is the nature of the changing in archive, particularly since 2007. I was speaking to a colleague in Tewkesbury Environment Agency who'd been active during the 2007 floods, and he just commented about the changes in technology and the implications. And certainly with flood archives, this is from Bristol born and bred, and his archive stream on Flickr of historic photographs. Okay, moving on. The historic past, looking at climate changes. Important to realise that if we're looking at historic floods, then we have had change over time. This is the Thames frozen over in the 17th century. Debate about the medieval warm period, Little Ice Age, we know from 1450 to 1450 to around 1850s, 1900s, and has been placed as late as 1910. So there's been changes in climate over the periods that we're looking at in terms of historical floods. And if we look at variability in historic precipitation, you can see from the plots there, I put those up really just to show that climate is highly variable, but you can see there are periods that I've highlighted there that have got high autumn rainfall. You can see if you've got the winter temperatures there that actually there's lots of fluctuations around mean conditions. And we have historically had these sorts of situations. We don't get them very frequently now. Okay, moving on to the main part of the talk. What I want to do now is to take 3 different case study areas and just to reflect on the value of the flood archive. So first I'm going to look in terms of reconstructing floods and flood patterns, their generating conditions and impacts. And I've cited 1 or 2 myths there. I'm not going to go through them all, but for example, that all floods are conditioned by are caused by the same generating conditions, that they are equally spaced in time, they occur in winter, and they're always measured. And if we look at the expert flow gauging, we'll see that gauge flow records are short. They can be non-stationary. Stationary means that stationarity means fluctuating around a stable mean condition. They're short. Most of the gauging records in the UK are 1930s onwards. If you're looking at the lower Severn, for example, it's 1970s onwards. So most river flow is under 50 years old. Limited density of network. Statistical analysis of extremes, a major problem here, actually assumes stationarity. So if you're dealing with non-stationary series, that becomes a bit problematic. You can see the plot at the bottom there. I don't have perhaps I do have but anyway, there's an extrapolation of the curve there in terms of predicting size of flood against return period. You've seen the variability, so detection of trends is difficult, and uncertainty in predictions. If we look at historic flood chronologies, we can see that they can actually draw a whole series of different types of quantitative information that might be useful in terms of flood science. So it's the scale of the flooding. Not all of them will give all this information, but you can draw from that science. What I want to do now is just to take 2 different settings where you might use flood science. The first is around looking at maximum probable flood, and looking at reconstruction of what are known as specific discharges. Specific discharges are discharges divided by catchment area. Okay, so it provides a standard measure. And looking at long-term flood patterns. So let's go back to the Muckle spate. This was a large regional summer frontal storm centred on the River Findhorn catchment. Largest flood in the historic record in northeast Scotland. Has been given a return period of over 500 years. And there's the quote there. The flood rose to the very top of the rock, making total perpendicular rise at this point no less than 50 feet. And it was marked by Lauder, the location. And Lauder's account allows us to go to 12 different locations down the River Findhorn and to go and actually try and reconstruct some of the hydraulic geometry of those particular floods, and through the indirect calculations to work out what the flood magnitude was. I've just given those examples. Again, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but he provides quite a lot of information about the character of the floods. And it's possible from those sorts of accounts to actually start to quantify some of the elements in terms of hydraulic geometry. So hydraulic radius, cross-sectional area. We went back and resurveyed those sites, hanging plumb lines over bridges, working out roughness, looking at water surface slope, and we were able to compute a series of discharges down here which have continuity in terms of their downstream increase in size. What is interesting about this particular flood is that we knew that it was the largest flood on record in the northeast of Scotland, but and when you plot it on this curve, the envelope curve for upland Britain, you can see that the plots give you new data for larger catchments in the UK. These ones up here are the Lynmouth floods, so you can see how they plot. And then they've got this strange box here that actually sits outside, and this was the original calculation of the 1970 flood, August 1970 flood on the Findhorn, which had sit in the archives in NERC's Flood Studies report for 30 years as the largest flood on record, 2,400 cumecs from a catchment of that size. As soon as we started to show the data for our estimates of the 1829 flood, it was the people in SEPA went back and looked at their data and downscaled it by over half. Okay, so they actually, using historical data here, has allowed that error in the archives to be addressed, but also given data which wouldn't normally be present under the envelope. Okay, the second example that I want to give you is around reconstructing flood patterns on the River Severn. And if we look at the 2007 floods, they were a very unusual occurrence. They brought a whole series of different interacting characteristics together in the same flood event. They really put surface water flooding on the map. And it was the largest amount of rainfall between April and July in the 21st century, actually. So this was a very distinctive event, and it poses questions about how frequently those sorts of events might occur. So if we look at the historical flood chronology, and I've been through a large range of sources just myself, but also working with community members, a whole series of different types of information we can garner from them. But also it's possible to identify from those when were the extreme floods occurred, when were flood years, when were flood clusters, when were flood-rich periods, to get some sort of semi-quantitative ranking, to look at hydrometeorological characteristics, i.e. the generating, the causal characteristics, and also to try and link them to weather circulation types, for example, Lamb's circulation types, which are series of already produced for the period 1661 to present. So if we look at flood stages at Gloucester, this is taken from records, it's a combined series, we can learn a bit about that flood in terms of wider context. You can see the 2007 flood there, but also the flood of 1947, which was the largest flood in record before 2007. And people sort of thought that flood couldn't be exceeded. It was snowmelt flood. It had a major snowmelt contribution. But what is interesting, remember that these are peak levels here, is that there are larger floods there sitting in the Little Ice Age in 1859 and 1809. You see the 1770 flood and the 1795 showing there. And if you look at extreme floods, they can actually occur in any season of the year. You can also do other things with the data, and I'm not going to attempt to go through this in a huge amount of detail here, but clearly one thing you can look at is seasonality and get some sense of what the Little Ice Age looks like in context of more recent flood-rich periods. And you can see, looking at the series there, that here we've got this period here, latter part of the 1870s, 1880s, very flood-rich, and flood-rich elsewhere as well. And you can see that there are other periods in the past where there are flood-rich periods. What's interesting when you look at these sorts of data is that winter flooding dominates. Autumn, 23% of floods in autumn, spring 13%, summer 9%. If we look at the Hall Bridge record on the lower Severn, autumn flooding 10%, summer flooding 1%. So if we actually look behind, if we look at longer timescales, then we start to see increased diversity in terms of flood seasonality. And we can see there are notable periods where autumn floods are significant, and you can see that some of those periods are actually coinciding with the periods that we highlighted with the rainfall records. And also you get periods with higher spring floods, you get periods with higher summer floods. So spring floods in some settings are up to 33% of the floods. It's also possible to look at the flood series in relation to circulatory conditions. This is looking at the historic flood series linked to land circulation patterns, and you can see this has been done for a whole series of circulation patterns, but I've selected a couple that here cyclonic dominates up to 36% of the historic floods in the series, and that's about 233 floods. 7 days antecedent, southwesterly also important. So you start to see the cyclonic conditions associated with particular floods. We also see that circulation patterns also cluster, as you can see in the diagram down here. You get periods where you've got increased types of circulation. Okay. And we also see that different generating conditions for extreme floods. So we've got the floods of 2007. We've got heavy, long duration rainfall, as we see in 2000 as well. Warm rain on snow. Importance of a tidal influence. That's one of the reasons why November 1770 was so large. Ice break, and also storm surge or tsunami. Some of you might have seen the material on the documentaries with Simon Hazlitt debating whether the 1607 event was a storm surge or a tsunami. I'm in the storm surge camp, I'm afraid. Okay, so what does the Severn record tell us? It tells us that extreme floods larger than the gauge record are evident in the historical record. It shows that you can get flood-rich periods, but more difficult to pick out trends. It shows you that floods, when we're looking at the lower Severn, can be caused by different conditions. And we get some insight into the Severn flood system if all the elements are switched on, and more elements were switched on in 1770 than they were in 2007. And we get some insight into little ice age flood patterns. In fact, you get flood-rich periods, flood years, enhanced snowmelt contributions. Okay, so historical approaches are useful within science. But let's look now at flood education and science communication. And some of the myths there, amongst the public particularly. Flood frequencies are well understood. If a 1 in 50-year flood occurs, then there'll be no flood of similar size for 50 years. Problems of public engagement. And so I went about this project. This was funded through the Royal Society, and it was really about connecting people to their flood histories as a means of understanding risk. So what we were asking, the people were looking at floods were experienced in 1990, 1993, 1998 and 2000. Just how large were these floods? What conditions caused them? How frequently might they be expected? What are their local impacts? So really linking archival research within communities to exploring about their own flood histories and their own flood heritage. And what you find is that extreme floods are very much in the public psyche. This is, again, talking about that tsunami. That was an event that was held at University of Newport to mark the 400-year anniversary. And you'd be surprised the number of people who still talk about that event in lore along the River Severn. And if we look at the mapping of the challenges in understanding flood science as perceived by the public, then there's a whole series of areas that are quite challenging if you're trying to communicate flood science. So, for example, troublesome concepts include probabilities, return period, understanding what uncertainty means in predictions. What does a risk-based approach mean? You know, how does the public what does that mean? Because that has really significant implications for the public. And also around human impacts. If we look amongst current flood myths, you know, the idea that extreme floods are unnatural comes in every meeting I go to. Extreme floods are caused because rivers have not been dredged. We've got some engineers here who can probably discuss that. That embankments and levees will protect us from floods. That extreme floods are caused by land use changes. And one extreme flood provides evidence of climate change. Now, so there's some weasel words in there, but they form the sort of basis for discussion, and sometimes the key word is extreme rather than moderate in those statements. And it poses questions when we approach flood education. This is a model of flood education from Australia, and one of the things that the authors highlight there, Dufty, is that adaptive capability and post-flood learnings are frequently the neglected elements of flood education. So it poses the question, how do you actually carry out flood education in communities that do not have post-flood experience? And one of the ways of doing that, I would argue, is about connecting those communities to their past and their flood histories. And so one of the things that I've proposed is a local flood histories approach to community flood education. It needs to be active. There's a sense sometimes about putting things through letterboxes or whatever, that forms flood education, but actually thinking about active ways. Historical reconstruction is one way that I've tried, but also learning. I've some examples here. Concept frame learning could be around uncertainty, but also learning from stories and flood memories and about community arts and science links. This was a project that I ran subsequent to the Royal Society one, because it was a sort of aha moment for me that there were a lot of people out there wanting to tell oral history accounts, and actually for some people the clock was ticking. I guess the clock is ticking for all of us. But anyway, I put in to do some, this was actually capturing oral history accounts in digital stories, working with artists but also students while I was at the University of Gloucestershire, and to set this up as a learning resource in terms of yes, for social learning within communities. Okay, that's a woman in her 90s recalling the floods of 1947. The sense of resilience there about poultry being put up in the attic, about going and being proactive in terms of rescuing your neighbours and so on. She also told me a priceless story about saving rabbits, which it was only as she got to the end of the story that I realised that saving rabbits from the trees actually meant putting them in the pot. That's post-war resilience for you. Okay, I talked about arts and approaches here. One of the things that I ran when I was at Gloucestershire was the Living Flood Histories Network, which was about bringing arts and humanities into discussions around resilience and environmental change. And from that project, which involved, we're just actually producing a themed edition of the Journal of Arts and Communities. It's going to be out very shortly from the network. But I got involved in a project called Multi-Story Water. That wasn't its original name. It was called Before the Flood, but that didn't seem to be very public-facing. And so this project was looking at seeing what oral history and performance theatre might bring to engage the public around flood risk. And in fact, it actually turned into a project that was not just about flood risk, but about engaging the communities around living with water, the challenges and the benefits of living with a river. And that would include hooks like nature and participatory citizenship in relation to water and so on. This picture here is actually of the Froome going through a concrete section in Eastville. And as part of that project, we used oral history as a stimulus. We went and gathered data. I noticed Jo's here. She'll be smiling because she volunteered in the assistance in terms of drawing that together. And it was very much a meeting of expert and local knowledge about bringing, it was the first time I'd ever worked with anybody from performance theatre. It really made me rethink my conceptions of research and practice and so on. And we ran a whole series of events, including a river story walk that combined science and stories. I see Patrick's here. He was you represented the Bristol City Council. We gathered together community videos around the river and showed them under the M32, actually showing pictures of the area on the area. And we had a promenade dance circus performance that had an arts facilitator. Again, the arts work was inspired by the stimulus of the oral history. Okay, let's move on in the final part just to explore the archive in terms of changing flood resilience. And again, I've highlighted some flood myths. That people get more resilient over time. You might think that was the case. That people actually act rationally in terms of risk. And that if people are aware of risk, they prepare. You can see some smiles around the room. So what can be learned about local flood heritage and resilience from studying past extreme floods? Well, if I go back to Lauder just as one case study example, changing understandings of nature, changing flood perceptions. And what are the implications of those changing flood perceptions over time in terms of strategies for flood risk management? If we look at Lauder, his orchestration of the Muckle Spate is very much around biblical imagery. It ties in with the debates around uniformitarianism and catastrophism around that time. You hear about the deluge comes, it pours down the furrowed mountains in 1,000 cataracts like a mighty host of gods, destroying angels, each separate cohort commissioned for its own special career of destruction. This is an educated man in the 1830s writing this. And this awful admission to a sinful land. I didn't really think of Scotland in those terms, but barriers to public perception now. Here's an example of just the range of different types of public perception you might get. It won't happen. It won't happen again. It won't happen again here for X years. It won't happen to me. I can't be bothered. This is more critical to my community. It does not matter what I do. It happens all the time. I'll be all right. I can't do anything about it. It's an act of God. And the government regulator, the Environment Agency, will protect me. Let's look here. One of the things that intrigued me from the archives was just the accounts you get of the 1947 floods versus those of 2007. And if we look at the human impacts of the 2007 floods, we can see that they were quite catastrophic for the communities in the Severn Valley. For some communities, it took a long time for people to get back into their houses. For some people, it was over a year. It was described in the Pitt Review as the most severe peacetime crisis. So, again, looking at the 1947 flood, what can we learn about resilience? If we look at this is the Pitt Review, one of the things that was really striking about it was the shift, the subtle shift, or perhaps not so subtle shift, towards positive community action and its future potential. And the language shifted to community lead adaptation planning, the notion of distributed responsibilities for dealing with residual risk. What does that mean? What does that mean to a member of the public? And it also has implications for community awareness and action. And if we look at historic resilience, resilience being the ability to cope with a stress or change and to function normally, then we can see that there's potential for the same place potential to change over time. And it poses questions about the nature of community resilience. Is it possible to go backwards as well as forward? So this is through the flood event, pre-flood, the actual event and your ability to bounce back and in terms of restoration and rehabilitation. If we look at the 1947 flood, this is a photograph from Gloucestershire Echo at that time. And you can see people going about their business in Tewkesbury. You can see low technology working well there in planks and so on. You can see the fire engine in the background. We have other oral history accounts. This was done for the 50-year anniversary. This was put together by the Environment Agency. This is a woman, interestingly, who now lives in Cheltenham, is sort of disconnected in terms of history. She says the floods of 1947 are something I'll never forget. We lived upstairs in our home in Gloucester 3 days before being rescued, taken in a rowing boat to dry land, farm near the house. 3 months before our home was habitable again because of water quality pollution. When the floods hit, I waded down waist-deep water in the streets to collect my baby. If I'd left her with my mother-in-law, I'd left her with my mother-in-law while I worked. I was a soldier's wife. I needed the money. It's surprising what you can do in a crisis. If we look at the nature of the evidence, this material was given to me in a large ward by somebody from Tewkesbury Borough Council Planning Department who'd obviously kept all the materials together. There'd been some legacy materials. We see evidence from the flood fund. In fact, if we look at the flood fund for the 7 floods in 1947, the average claim was between £20 and £33, okay, which translates in 2010 cost to between £500 and £850. So the sense of how much material people have in their houses and to be potentially damaged. And also information about, like here, this example here from the Ministry of Health gives 13 different ways of drying upholstery and furniture, depending on whether you're in a rural area or an urban area. Okay, so a culture of reuse of rather than throwing away. And when we look at flood memory and knowledge comparing 1947 and 2007, we can see people have got past experience of extremes. We can see of flood-rich periods. Actually, in the Severn, it was pretty flood-poor in the 1970s, 1980s. Most people didn't realize there was flood risk until floods started to come again in the 1990s. The relationships between local and expert knowledge, the fact that extreme floods were actually learning experiences, that the scale of flooding was important there. The changing way floods are materialized now, the different creative practices that are available and use of technology. And also knowledge of traditional ways of coping and living in floods. The fact that you could actually sweep through your house, you had plaster that was resilient to water and so on. I'm sure there are people in this room that know a bit more about this than I. But the resilient way that houses were built. Also interesting is about the perceived role of government, responsibility for taking your own safety. It's probably not insignificant that it was immediately post World War II. We still have the army ducks there. There was a sense of normality. People were going to school on the ducks and so on. Another thing that's really interesting is about the nature of community and its capital in those settings. Strong sense of community based on flood heritage and what might be described a watery sense of place based on previous flood experience. And you see community and social networks working, really important alongside the initiative of key individuals that was reported in newspapers, mayors, town clerks, ministers, in terms of approach to relief. And also the knowledge of who might be vulnerable in your community? Recurrent accounts of helping poor urban communities, for example in Gloucester, living in second floor rooms. And it does pose, for me, questions about the position of community. Where are we on this continuum from, the government will protect us from flooding, and that associated with that is a paradigm of thinking of structural flood defence and where engineering solutions reign supreme. And where we need to be, that we're all responsible for our own safety. And that is a paradigm thinking through in terms of partnerships, in terms of flood risk management, and also flood education being really critical. And it involves reducing the risk of flooding and the consequences of flooding should this happen for all members of community, not just some of the community. So again, it poses questions about where we are on that continuum. And when we look at key concepts in flood risk management, some of the things that are bubbling through there around the importance of informal, of lay, of local knowledge. Lay knowledge is really critical. It plays out in terms of scale at 1-to-1. Actually observing on the ground the microgeography of how water plays out. And so almost as citizen science observing these things. The notion of watery sense of place and care of place, of caring where you live for and valuing that. Notions of flood heritage, and particularly the idea of heritage from below as described by Robertson, rather than say heritage from above, about flood heritage as it's lived out in communities. And the importance of folk memories of flooding that might be passed down from community to community, of big floods in the past and what to do when big floods occur, of flood wisdom and resilience. And this brings me to the final project I wanted to mention to you, was the Sustainable Flood Memory Project. There's been a bit of controversy. We had some adverse blog comments about the use of sustainable in this context, but I'll defend it, I think, about linking memory of extreme floods and local flood knowledge, about memory that is community focused, that is archival, that integrates individual and collective experiences, that involves both vertical memory, i.e. between generations, but also intergenerational memory, but also thinks about strategies for its future. And what we've been doing in the Severn catchment over the last 24 months or so is taking the 2007 flood and researching how communities remember and archive their flood experiences, a major event like that, and looking to see how the memories are materialized, assimilated, embedded, and actually protected within the culture. And then thinking of this in a more applied context about how flood memory might link to local knowledge and how that might have a particular role in terms of developing community resilience. And then finally, thinking not just about communities themselves and how they might support memories, the development of memories and local knowledge within their communities, but also thinking about how other agencies who are charged with flood risk management might engage with and support the development of those memories. I'm not going to give details of the communities, but we chose the communities in ways where they differed. We went for a community that was established, one which didn't have flood experience or hadn't had flood experience for quite a while, and also a community which has been flooded quite a lot but has a lot of transient people in it, and also lower socioeconomic groups. And we actually added in an urban-rural contrast on the basis of our advisory group, suggesting that that would be a good way forward. So what I've done in these slides is just to show one or two emerging themes because I think they're interesting. I mean, what we found was that flood memory was very much alive among some areas of the communities in the Severn Valley. And we found flood marking. I'll show you one or two examples in a minute. We found archiving of different ways, emerging use of new technology in social networking sites. And we also found archiving in building, in the sense of buildings, in memory, because you have your house in a particular way, because you've got sockets up high, because you've got rugs on the floor rather than carpets, and so on. So resilience and resistance measures actually also being an aid to memory in buildings. If we look at flood marking in the valley, in the Severn Valley, this is a whole series of flood marks, but let me just highlight an example. This is a pub in the Severn Valley. It's marked the 2007 flood, and actually it's repainted the 1947 at the same time. Okay. Here we've got a setting where this was on a tea shop in Upton-on-Severn. I took the photographs relatively soon after the floods. Went back 6 months later. Mark gone. Mark here outside a pub, again in Upton-on-Severn. Marks on the gantry in the pub. That's now gone. It was a temporary thing now, but the gantry's also gone in the redevelopment of the pub after the floods. And we also see flood marks being moved around, actually perception is that they've been corrected, and I'm sure that's the case. So flood marking in itself is an interesting one, but it does have a very local, in terms of flood histories, it brings that very, very clearly within communities. Also new community archives. This is a Flickr site which was for the Tewkesbury 2007 of people uploading their images of the flood. And I just quoted from Derrida there, what is no longer archived in the same way is no longer lived in the same way. Rapid changes in the sharing of materials. And what I want to do now is, I realise I'm beginning to run out of time, just to look at a few emerging themes. The value of childhood memories. This is for a woman in Gloucester. Ever since I was a youngster, I can remember the floods coming in, and it was a regular thing in February. You looked over the meadows, we called it. It's now a landfill site. And because the river would overflow, you keep an eye on it, you see it's coming, get the furniture up, get the carpets up. That sense of living, that connection with the river, and the sense of living with flooding. But one of the things we found when we looked at, in our interviews, was also the issue of active forgetting. Some people actively prefer not to remember floods because they associate them with painful and traumatic memories. And that poses questions as to who are these people, what sorts of people are in that situation. And it also poses some issues around the connection of local knowledge, with reality. Because this quote here is citing that, obviously for 2 or 3 years after, every bit of rain, every bit of flooding terrified some people, absolutely terrified them. They thought it was all going to happen again. And what message is conveyed with flood alleviation works? It will never happen again, or this is a flood risk area. And here we are, this is an example. We felt reasonably confident in the 1970s. We put up new defences, they were working well. Semi-derelict houses were bought and completely rebuilt. We were quite confident, really, only to be hit badly in 2007. And also active forgetting to ignore flood risk, but also the sense of getting back into business. Tewkesbury residents very concerned, particularly businesses there, over flood town reputation. And also some of the things that's coming through is the tensions between individual memory and organisational memory. So I suppose we do our bit here, but I don't think the councils do enough. You've got to go and interview them. I don't think they do enough to remember, do they? They want to choose to forget. Okay, so some of the tensions coming through about individual memory and organisational memory. But finally, on a more positive note, floods as a catalyst for action. This is an example of a rural community. In my day, 40 years ago, wanted to improve the flood banks. We had a subcommittee, increased the height of the flood. After 2007, they realized that they needed to do something again. An association of people came together, sort of grit the floods to bring these people together. They formed a subcommittee. They started making plans to get grants. They got those grants. They put in flood defences in partnership with the Environment Agency. So, sustainable flood memory, just some just little conclusions there before I move on to my final conclusion. It was about memory can be practiced vertically as well as horizontally, about between generations and over time, but also in the moment of flooding. And it's the connection of those two axes, the vertical and the horizontal, that perhaps provides the greatest opportunities for intergenerational learning around past coping strategies in floods. And this is one of the areas that could be developed as a way of building community resilience. So, flood futures, the value of the archive. I thought I would just show you this slide because it gives you some sense of the changes that are predicted. At present, if we look, this is from the Severn Flood Management Plan, River Severn Valley Flood Management Plan, estimated around 29,000 properties, 60,000 people in the Severn catchment are at risk from a 1% flood event, i.e. a 1 in 100-year flood. Expected that those figures could rise by much as 12% in the next 50 to 100 years. That means that a 1% event could flood up to 33,000 properties and 68,000 people could be at risk. And if you look at the differences here, the examples of, I'm not sure you can read, Shrewsbury, Worcester, Tewkesbury, Tenbury Wells, Coventry, Leamington Spa and Warwick, Tewkesbury. Okay, so my final two slides just in conclusion was further about, I would argue very strongly, the value, delay, I think.
We've got 29 minutes.
Is that, who's put this on? Okay, I see that. Everything's shutting down. Okay, looking forward, just two slides anyway. I would argue for the importance of the flood archive as a dynamic resource that's not static. I would argue it's a major resource in flood science and social science in a climate change context. The importance of looking back to look forward in terms of understanding floods and their impacts, but also the value of new interdisciplinary engagements with the flood archive, because I think that changes who the stakeholders are, who are the voices in flood risk management, with the diversity, with technology. There are new voices that are archived for flood risk management. If we look at flood science, my first case study, we get insights into the full range of flood generating conditions. We can look at the reconstructed past as an analogue for present and future, particularly when we're looking at flood-rich periods. And we see that the notion of frequency of flood extremes is highly conditioned to the timescale of study. Okay, so if you ask somebody about how floods are frequent, you really have to put some parameters around it. If we look at flood education, remember the comments I made about post-flood learning, extremely important, the re-engagement, the reconnection to our collective sense of flood heritage when engaging with flood risk and trying to understand what uncertainty means. And if we look at flood resilience and community flood resilience, individual flood resilience, about the importance of understanding resilience and looking back to look forward. So looking at, in flood risk management, looking at lessons for resilience building are not just about the present, they can draw strength from the past. And just one of the things I cited in the flyer to this was around different types of knowledges. I think that one of the things that's quite striking is changing understandings of the contributions of local and expert knowledge, that local knowledge come from living through floods needs to be brought to the table, and it actually starts to get people to reconsider who might be considered expert. Thank you.